Welcome to the FemiNinja Project. I am your host, Cheryl Ilov, middle-aged ninja hiding in plain sight, dedicated to restoring human dignity one person at a time and helping you unleash your personal power. Discover that it's possible to look like a woman, act like a lady, move like a ninja, and think like a warrior. And remember, men are always welcome on the FemiNinja Project. Today I wanted to talk about flexibility, or shall I say lack thereof, because a lot of us feel like we lose flexibility, especially as we're getting older, and it really doesn't have to be that way. However, sometimes we'll wake up in the morning and wonder who managed to sneak into our bed in the middle of the night, let alone our bodies, and pour cement in our joints and our muscles. Or maybe even just trying to get out of a chair after sitting for a long period of time, or getting out of the car after a long drive makes us feel like we're the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz who's been sitting in the woods for years and years and years and just can't even get to that oil can. If only we could, oil can, maybe we would be able to lubricate our joints and we'd be able to move a little bit better. And wouldn't that be wonderful? And the truth is, a lot of us experience a loss of flexibility, especially as we get older. And oftentimes we seem to accept it as a quote-unquote normal part of the aging process, whatever that means. But the truth is, it's not really related to getting older. It's more a direct result of our activity level or lack thereof. And that has a much greater impact on our flexibility than simply getting older does. I still have a vivid memory from physical therapy school from one of my textbooks, and that was a long time ago, so obviously it made a very, very significant impression on me, and it's just seared into my memory bank and something that I don't think I will ever forget. And it was a chart which was comparing the degenerative effects of injuries, a sedentary lifestyle, and the aging process on human tissues and flexibility. And it's funny because most people would think that the aging process is the one that would have the most significant destructive impact on the human tissues. But guess what? The least destructive impact on flexibility was the quote-unquote aging process. And the most detrimental effect was a consequence of a sedentary lifestyle. And that goes back to something that I said back in episode Fit Tips for Life, which is that sitting is evil, and so is a sedentary lifestyle. And it does explain why it took me so long to get my flexibility after I finished graduate school. So we do not have to lose flexibility as we get older. But even if we are physically active and we stretch our muscles on a regular basis, we can still feel stiff and tight. And there's a reason behind that. And it's not because, contrary to popular belief, improving our flexibility is not as simple as trying to stretch our tight muscles. And there is a physiological reason for that, which I will get to in just a few minutes. But before we talk about that, I do have to ask you a question. Have you ever noticed sometimes when you're feeling stiff or tight and you stretch that you actually feel worse and maybe even more tight after you finished stretching? Maybe that happens to you sometimes, maybe it's never happened to you, but oftentimes it does. And there is a reason for that. And it's not because you're doing something wrong or you're doing something incorrectly or you're bad. It's just because of how our bodies work. Because oftentimes it's not tight muscles that are causing the problem, but a lack of mobility in our joints. And you might think, well, there is nothing that you can do about that. Not true. Yes, there is. Our muscles are inherently flexible and they have a rich supply of blood and they're very elastic. It's when the muscle fibers start to transition into tendons and ligaments and the soft tissue that is surrounding our joints and our joint capsules that we start to get into trouble. When we don't use our joints in the full range of motion that we have available to them, that soft tissue starts to get tight. And that soft tissue, the tendons, the ligaments, and the connective tissue surrounding the joints is full of nerve endings. And these nerve endings, their responsibility is to help keep the joint healthy. And when we're not using those joints in the full range of motion, it is that soft tissue that begins to tighten up. And then when we try and stretch, it sends signals to that soft tissue that says, whoa, hang on a minute, you better be careful, because if you do this, you are going to damage your joint. You're going to rip something. So it sends a signal to your brain going, danger, 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 Will Robinson, stop. So that sends that signal back down to the soft tissue that says, tighten up even more so that you can protect the joint. So this is a vicious cycle that has started. And one more time leaves us screaming for the Tin Man's oil can. Let me take a few minutes to explain how this works, and I'm going to use our hip joints as an example because I just love the hip joint. It's got such an incredible range of motion available to it, and if you could see it, if you saw a picture of the hip joint, we think of our hips as like hands-on hip position. No, that's not it. That is actually our pelvis, which is a beautiful structure all in itself, and we'll get into the pelvis much later in later episodes because it really is fascinating. And that is where actually most movement begins and initiates, is from our pelvis. But if you go a little bit lower than your hands-on hips, and you can feel sometimes even that little bump in the top of your leg, the top of your thigh on the side of your thigh, that is where your hip joint is. It is where the ball and socket connect. So the ball is the top of your thigh bone, and it's a round surface, and it fits beautifully in the cup of the pelvis called the acetabulum, and it has a lovely movement available to it, and the ball and socket glides and slides and rolls in that cup of the pelvis, and every time it does that, it works as an internal oil can. So we actually have our own oil can as we are moving our joint in this wide variety of different movements available to it. We're stimulating that production of what is called synovial fluid that keeps the joint lubricated, healthy, nutrients getting into the joint and helping to remove toxins out, more circulation. It's a lovely, beautiful phenomenon of nature and how our bodies work. Unfortunately, most of us use our hip joints as a hinge joint, meaning that it just goes forward, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, like going upstairs and walking. That rotation that we do have available to us in our hip joints, then we start to lose it. And that soft tissue, when we do try and go in that direction, gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And what happens then too is not only does that hip joint start to get tighter, the soft tissue gets tighter, and it's giving those signals down to the muscles. So the muscles are starting to feel tight as well. But it also puts even more pressure and strain on your low back because the mobility from the hip joint that the hip joint is not taking over for us is going into the pelvis and our low back. So our low back and our pelvis is trying to compensate for this lack of movement in the hip joint and can end up causing tremendous pain and dysfunction in our low back and our pelvis and our hips as well. A vicious cycle has begun, and it is a classic example of use it or lose it, or as I like to say, move it or lose it. And we usually don't recognize this insidious onset of the loss of the joint function and mobility, but it does get our attention when we start to feel tight and stiff. And then we might try the traditional stretching, thinking that that's going to help loosen us, but then, we get the rebound effect of the muscles actually tightening up once it gets those messages from our brain that we're going to damage the joint. However, the good news is that we can improve our flexibility by first lubricating our joints with gentle movement and gentle joint mobilization. So what that does is it relaxes and loosens the soft tissue surrounding our joints, stimulating healthy joint function, and it gets that synovial fluid moving in our joints. Our own personal internal oil can. So then once we get our joints moving more easily and more naturally and more freely in the range of motion that they do have available to them, then we get a lot more benefit from stretching our muscles. So once again, our body and the systems of our body work so beautifully together in harmony, and that's just the way it is as long as we set the stage and give ourselves a chance to maximize what we've got. So let me give you a couple of ideas how you can get started on improving your flexibility even before you get out of bed in the morning. So before you just hop out of bed and start running around and wondering what happened to you in the middle of the night when you were sleeping, just take a few moments to do some simple little ankle pumps. So just moving your ankles back and forth. Not only is that going to help lubricate your ankle joints and get the muscles of your feet and your lower legs moving, you're going to get a little bit more circulation. And And the reason why we wake up so stiff in the morning is because we haven't been moving for how many hours? 8 hours, or in my case, 10 hours. And we need to give our bodies the messages that, okay, now we're awake and we're going to be upright and weight bearing for the rest of the day. So starting with your ankles, just as I said, gently moving them, pointing and flexing just to get the legs going, the feet and the ankles. And then you can take a moment to just roll your legs in very gently. So you might want to bend your knees and start to do like a little bit of a wave or a windshield wiper type of movement with your knees just to get your hips going. And that'll actually help even wake up your back muscles a little bit. Again, you're just trying to get some circulation moving. You're trying to get your lymphatic flow going, and you're trying to give your body the message that it's time to wake up and start moving, rather than by jarring it by just hopping out of bed and hoping for the best. You can then start to just roll your shoulders a little bit, doing little gentle shoulder rolls. You can extend your arms toward the ceiling and just start to alternate your arms, reaching one toward the other. Again, that's warming up your shoulder joints. It's waking up the muscles of the front of your chest, the back across the shoulder blades, and just giving you that signal that, okay, we're waking up. You can even take a moment to roll your head a little bit to side, and maybe even nod your head up and down like you're saying yes very gently, and then no, side to side. Again, these are just very simple things that can help get that synovial fluid moving, as well as the signals to all of the systems that it is all systems go. And then, and this is really important, how you get out of bed really does matter. I know it sounds ridiculous, but how do you get out of bed? Do you just kind of shoot up from a lying down position? That's a little, once again, jarring to your body and to your nervous system, and it can strain your neck and your back as well. So a more effective way to get out of bed is to roll over to one side and then slowly swing your legs off the side of the bed and gently push yourself up to a sitting position. So that's going to be a lot more user-friendly on your body and your joints, and it will actually help get a little bit more stimulation into the joints itself, into the hip joints and into your spine, and it's a whole lot more gentle to your neck and to your body as well. And then just scoot yourself to the edge of the bed, kind of test your sea legs a little bit, get your feet on the floor, feel your feet against the floor, and then push yourself up into a standing position and go about your day. A few years ago, I worked with a gentleman. I had a client that I absolutely adored. He was about my age, even though he told me he was much older than me, and I just kind of went with that and said, okay, well, that works for me. He was also very health conscious and was really working hard to take care of himself, especially because he had so many injuries when he was younger as a young athlete. And he would start his morning by getting out of bed, doing his stretches, and then doing his morning walk. And when he would do his walk, it was a very kind of a pounding power walk, and he would go for a long distance. And every time he came to my office, he would tell me that he was just feeling really stiff and tight, and no matter what he did, he was just really uncomfortable, and he would stretch so much. After a while, we talked about it a little bit more, and then together we kind of concluded that maybe he should change his routine and see what happened. So from that moment on, instead of hopping out of bed and doing his stretches, he started with a little gentle wake-up call and did some of the maneuvers that I have already told you about. And then he would get out of bed, and then he did his walk. And when he completed his walk and came home, that's when he did his series of stretches. And the results were absolutely short of miraculous. But he gave his body a chance to really wake up and get the idea that he was going to be upright and functional. Then he went on his walk, and when his muscles were really warm and his body was really awake and alert, and he had already done some gentle joint mobilization, then he stretched his muscles and he got much more bang for his buck. So it's something worth thinking about. And the one thing that I did forget to tell you about is not to forget about your hands. Do not neglect your hands. So even before you get out of bed in the morning, just extend your fingers as long as you can. So it's just a way of extending your fingers and spreading them apart, and just do just a passive stretch like that. Actually, it's an active stretch. And do that with both hands and hold it for a few seconds and do it for at least 5 repetitions. rotations, and continue to do that stretch in particular during the course of the entire day. Because if you think about our hands and how much we use them, and every single thing that we do with our hands is to reach and to grab, so we're flexing our fingers and we're holding on to either utensils or, machinery that we're working, or maybe driving a car, or in my case, I used to knit a lot, and after I'd be knitting for hours at a time, I'd have to stretch my hands because they would feel really stiff and tight. A lot of my clients would come in and complain about their hands being weak, and they wanted me to give them exercises to strengthen their hands, and they would show me that they were losing grip strength, and they wanted me to give exercises where they could improve their grip strength by holding on to something or squeezing a ball and that type of thing. And I had to explain to them that they were doing that all day long already, and what they needed to do was to move their hands and their fingers in the opposite direction of what they were doing all day long. And again, the results were miraculous. Once we do the same movement over and over and over, that repetitive movement is when we get the injuries, the stiffness, the damage to our joints. So don't neglect your hands, and really take the time several times during the day to stretch them. Which brings me to another subject, our feet. Our poor little feet take so much abuse, being shoved into shoes all day long and supporting our weight, and they get so ignored. Don't ignore your feet. I can actually do an entire podcast on the agony of the feet, and I probably will do that in the future, but just take a few minutes to stretch out your feet. And that might sound weird, but just sit on the edge of a firm chair. Again, I love sitting on the edge of a firm chair so you can feel your sit bones. That gives wonderful, strong signals to your pelvis, your spine, and your nervous system. Wakes up your entire body, really works on your awareness of your postural alignment. And you might not even be able to do this at first. It took me probably about 6 months before I could get any action in my feet. But keep your feet on the floor and try to lift all 5 of your toes on both feet off of the floor, but leave the entire rest of your foot, the heel, the ball of your foot, the ball of the big toe joint, and the ball of the little toe joint on the floor at the same time that you lift and separate your toes. You might look and say nothing's happening, but there is still a lot going on, even if your toes aren't moving at all, because just the idea of trying to lift and separate your toes, even if physically you can't see anything happening, it is activating the pathways in your brain that are responsible for moving your toes. So even if you can do it just in your imagination, or just thinking about how you would do it, again, you're getting the benefit of it even if your toes aren't moving. And if you do this exercise every single day, I would suggest at least twice a day, in the morning and then in the evening after you get home from work, or once you get your comfy slippers on, just to stretch your feet out and strengthen the muscles of your feet and your toes is going to make an incredible difference. There are so many foot deformities, abnormalities, and pain syndromes that can be not only prevented, but corrected when you do start working your feet. I have bunions. It's not from ballet. It's actually from my mom and dad. They both had bad feet. And I was starting to get a hammer toe on my right foot and even a Morton's neuroma, which is 60 shades of hell. It feels like you're walking on a tiny little hard marble or a pea right underneath the second toe of your foot. And it always felt like that second toe joint when I would try and lift it was fractured. But once I started doing these exercises, of course, nothing happened. I would look at my feet and it's like, why aren't they moving? I'm telling them to move. I'm telling the toes what to do, and the toes are just ignoring me. But eventually the signals were getting there to my brain and back down to my feet. And eventually I could see them start to move a little bit. And now I can almost, what I like to say, play the piano with my toes, which really isn't true because I can't even play the piano with my fingers, let alone my feet. But you get the idea. It's really important to work your feet. And let's continue on with the rest of your lower body. Once again, as I mentioned in my previous episode, I absolutely love the exercise balls, those huge fitness balls or fit balls that they've got. Having one at home is an absolute must for your fitness, your flexibility. It does wonders for you. But even just sitting on the ball with your feet flat on the floor and very, very slowly just start to roll a little bit forward and backward on the ball. So the key thing to remember is to go very very, very, very slowly. And as you're doing this, just feel what's happening in your ankle joints. So just the moving forward very, very slowly and back is mobilizing your ankle joints. Again, just see if you can keep your feet on the floor very solid and keeping those toes nice and long, no gripping with your feet. And it's just a wonderful way to not only mobilize your ankle joints, but to start and get the muscles of your lower leg moving. And then bring your attention to what's happening in your knees. Because as you're doing this, as you're just gently moving back and forth, you're actually mobilizing your knee joints. And to make sure that you're getting just as much bang for your buck as you possibly can, make sure that when you're sliding forward, that your knees are going directly over the first and second toe of your feet. You don't want to roll your knees inward or outward. Having that really good alignment and keeping the equal distance between your two knees is very, very important. Again, now start going up the body a little bit more and notice what's happening in your hip joints, because even that going forward and back is starting to mobilize the hip joints as well. So like I said, more bang for your buck, and I really like waking up all the systems at the same time. Not only does it save time, but it's very effective and it's efficiency and motion at the same time. And let's move to the shoulders. Again, shoulder rolls are just wonderful. I really prefer doing them one at a time so you concentrate on what you're doing. Again, when you can use your attention and your focus as you're doing any kind of movement or exercise, you're going to get a whole lot more benefit from it rather than just kind of doing it and checking it off the list. Get it done, get it done. It's really the opportunity to pay attention to yourself and how your body moves and what you're feeling as you do move. So taking one shoulder at a time, just leaving the arm nice and hanging down by your side, gentle little shoulder rolls backwards. So just lifting the shoulder up, back, and down. And the key thing to remember too is to work within an easy range of motion gently without pain or strain. If you feel like you're struggling or if it's hurting, back off and just do minimal movement. And remember that less is more. You don't want to work in a range of pain or discomfort, and here is why. Because if you do that, you automatically go into the fight or flight, freeze or bite, your sympathetic nervous system. And what happens then, it's a survival mechanism. So you're going into survival mode and all systems are on alert. And the first thing that happens is that your muscles tighten up because you are in survival mode. So do not work into pain or strain or stress. The old saying, no pain, no gain, not apply here. You can go ahead and beat yourself up once you're fully warmed up and you have all the flexibility that you want and you're not going to hurt yourself. So keeping that in mind, continue to do your shoulder rolls. You can go from forward, up, and back to back, up, and forward. So do both sides, and then let's move on to your neck. And I see people stretching their neck sometimes, and I cringe in horror. You don't want to yank on your neck. You want to be gentle. Just start by turning your head side to side. So you just slowly turn and look to the right. Use your eyes to track the motion of your head as you go back to the left, and just again, it's like a very slow saying no, but you're doing it very slowly. Using your eyes too, there is an incredible connection, a neurological connection between the movement of your eyes and the amount of muscle tone in your neck. So oftentimes when we hold our eyes in a specific fixed position for long periods of time, for example, being on the computer, that actually tightens up our neck muscles. As I said, there's an incredible connection between the eyes, the eye movement, the eye musculature, and the muscles of our neck. So that's why it's really important to keep your neck moving. And again, you don't want to do those yanking stretches on your neck because that could just tighten you up even more. So start with a gentle side to side of turning your head, and then start with a very gentle lifting and lowering of your head as if you were saying yes, very, very slowly. So I would start with doing that. And then once you feel that your neck is warm, you can start doing very, very gentle head tilts side to side, once again going very slowly. Another thing that I like to do for myself, because my neck can get really whacked out sometimes, is that when I tilt my head to the right to bring it back up to the starting position, I'll take my right hand, the fingertips of my right hand, and gently help it come back to the center. And I do the same thing when I go to the left. So it just gives a little bit of added support and comfort. The fingers just gently touching your temple gives something called the proprioceptive input, that tactile stimulation and touch, which is not only comforting and giving support, but it's giving a lot more information to your nervous system and your brain for a full body experience, and even more benefit than you would get if you were just grabbing your neck and pulling on it. You may have noticed that we haven't really talked about the spine and spine stretching for right now, because this can be really kind of tricky, especially if you already do have some type of back pain or back injury, because back pain or back injuries can be classified in two major categories, and that is either a flexion injury or an extension injury, which simply means with a flexion injury that's something that happened when you were in the bending forward position, which would be something like a bulging disc injury or something called spinal stenosis, which is a narrowing of the spine where the spinal cord goes through and puts pressure on the nerves, resulting in pain. The other basic category of a back injury would be extension injury, which means something that happens when you're going backward or back bending. And an example of that would be something called spondylolisthesis, where one of the vertebrae will slip forward on the spine, causing compression of the nerves in that area, and can be incredibly painful. So that's why it's very important when you want to start mobilizing your spine to know your spine very well and to take appropriate caution when necessary. It's important to keep in mind that even if we don't have any back injuries or back pain, that our spine has a set pattern, a preferred pattern of movement, just based on what we do all day long, or it could be hereditary or whatever. But it's really important to know what your preferred position of your spine is. And you can explore this and play with this a little bit with this simple little movement exercise or activity. It's based on something that I learned in my martial arts training called Let Your Knees Be Your Teacher, which is also something that I learned in my Feldenkrais training. And a lot of the exercises and the ideas that I'm sharing with you are based on not only the principles of martial arts, but the principles of Pilates, even dance, and something called Feldenkrais, which is a highly sophisticated form of neuromuscular re-education based on the scientific principle of neuroplasticity, meaning that we can always learn new patterns and new methods of moving, sensing, feeling, and thinking during the course of our entire lifetime, which sounds like a no-brainer, no pun intended. But even when I was in physical therapy school 22 years ago, we were taught that this magic miracle of nature, neuroplasticity, disappeared at the age of 14. And we do know now that that is simply not true. So I'm going to share this little exercise with you of how you can find what your preferred position of your spine is, and how you can discover that your knees and what you do with your knees has an impact on your spine and can actually help your spine relax and mobilize a little bit more in a gentle way, even while being respectful to your habitual patterns of movement. So just stand with your feet about hip width apart and just notice the shape of your spine and how your back feels. Does your back feel loose? Does it feel tight? Do you have any discomfort? And then very gently relax your knees. Now, I don't mean bend your knees so you're not going to be in that monkey position that they sometimes do in Tai Chi, but just gently release them and relax them a little bit and notice the shape of your spine now. How has it changed, and how does your low back feel now? So very slowly and gently go from straightening your knees to gently relaxing your knees, back and forth. And again, I can't emphasize enough that it's important to go very slowly and notice what you feel in your low back. And at what point does your back feel the most comfortable, almost like your spine is gently hanging in space and there's no strain or stress on your low back? So again, just gently going back and forth from bending your knees slightly to straightening your knees, and just explore with that and notice, when does your back feel the best? For most people, it is with the knees slightly relaxed, because oftentimes we'll stand with our knees really, really straight, thinking that that's good posture. But what happens, it really puts a lot of strain and stress on our low back, makes the muscles of our low back work overtime, and it starts a real cascade of not only discomfort and tightness, but it can travel all the way up to our neck and our shoulders and our hips and all the way down to our knees and our feet. So just walk around the room a little bit and see how you feel in walking, and then try that little movement exercise again, and then walk around the room a few times again. And just notice your knees affect the shape and the sensations in your back and in your spine. So it's just a really interesting and very educational little movement exercise. And now here's the last little tip that I'm going to give you today to help with your flexibility. And that is to get down on the floor at least once every single day. And I'm serious. Getting down on the floor does wonders, not only for your flexibility, balance as well. As adults, we don't get down on the floor very often, and as a result, we develop kind of a mistrust or a fear of the floor, and eventually we can develop a fear of falling, and that happens a lot of times as we mature. Now, when we were children, we were down on the floor, down and up, down and up, down and up all day long. Of course, we were much shorter then and closer to the floor, but it was very important as we got older when we were sitting in chairs and not getting down on the floor because it was kind of frowned upon, and why would you get down there? But it's really, truly important not only to our flexibility, but our health and vitality as we continue to, as I say, mature. I hate that phrase, getting older, or the quote-unquote aging process. It just drives me crazy. So even if it's not graceful, or if it's difficult, or you might have to hang on to sturdy furniture or maybe the edge of the couch as you're getting down on the floor and back up again, just keep working on it. Be patient with yourself and keep trying it, because it really is that important. And I have to tell you, I had a client one time and she was just wonderful. And, she had been coming to me for conditioning, basic conditioning. And she took one of my Feldenkrais classes one time. And at the very end of the class, I always would like to leave people with some fit tips or something that they can use when they go home. And the one thing I left them with was to get down on the floor every single day. Well, she came to her Pilates session the following week and told me that she absolutely could not get down on the floor. End of discussion. It wasn't going to work. And I said, well, that's okay. You've been working really hard and you've made a lot of progress, so don't worry about it. And neither one of us mentioned it again until about a month later when she came in for her weekly Pilates session, and she just casually happened to mention to me that not only was she getting down on the floor once a day, she was getting down on the floor twice a day. I was absolutely flabbergasted, and I said, whoa, when did this happen and how did this happen? And she said, well, I just figured it out. I kept doing it until finally I figured out how I could get down on the floor, and now it's even easy. I was absolutely blown away. And then she told me that one single tip was the best advice that she ever got from anyone. And it's really interesting to think about it because she had really bad arthritic knees and she just had an incredible difficult time with her mobility and her flexibility. But once she started getting down on the floor and back up again every day, her flexibility, her mobility, her joint range of motion improved tremendously. It was a significant improvement. This is the really interesting part. She was expecting her first grandchild in the next 6 months. That was her motivation. So it is important for each one of us to figure out what does motivate us. What is our reason why? Because it is different for each and every one of us, and it does help a lot if we know what it is exactly that does motivate us. It's also important to remember that the flexibility of our bodies are closely related to the flexibility of our mind and our spirit, because one does affect the other. And it's important to exercise your flexibility in how you think and how you react to life situations. One of my favorite quotes from Moshe Feldenkrais is, "What I am after is not flexible bodies. What I am after is flexible brains." And I think that is fabulous, because when you can be flexible in your thinking, you can move through life more easily and effortlessly, even when the going gets tough. And that is the way of the FemiNinja. And that's a wrap on another episode of the FemiNinja Project. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, be safe, be strong, and until next time, bye now.